The speech is perfect. You know it's perfect because you wrote it, and because Senator Hargrove is delivering it exactly as you intended. The pauses landing where you placed them. The cadence rising through the third paragraph like a tide finding its level. The crowd responding on cue as if they'd been rehearsed. You should feel proud. Instead, you feel the specific nausea of a person who knows that every beautiful word in that speech is built on a foundation that would not survive contact with the truth. You stand at the back of the hall with your lanyard and your clipboard and your practiced expression of invisible competence, and you think, I made this possible. The question you can't answer yet is whether that's something to be ashamed of. You came to political speech writing the way most people come to it, through language, through a genuine belief that words could do real work in the world. You'd been a journalist first, then a communications consultant, and somewhere along the way discovered that the thing you were best at was not reporting the story, but shaping it. Finding the sentence that could hold a complicated idea without breaking it. The phrase that could make an abstraction feel personal, and a policy position feel like a human truth. Senator Hargrove had recruited you 4 years ago, coming off his re-election campaign with momentum and an eye towards something larger. He was a compelling figure, intelligent, disciplined, with a kind of deliberate charisma that felt earned rather than performed. In your first meeting, he'd said something that stayed with you. I don't want someone who writes what I tell them. I want someone who understands what I mean and finds the better version of it. It was exactly the right thing to say to exactly the kind of person you were, and you'd taken the job the same week. The work had been good for most of those 4 years. Real legislation, real impact, the occasional speech that you felt genuinely proud of. You'd been in the room for important things, not as a decision maker, but as the person responsible for how the decisions were communicated, which is a different kind of power and not an insignificant one. Words shape reality, not just by describing it, but by determining which parts of it people focus on and which parts recede into the background. You understood that. You had always understood that. What you hadn't fully reckoned with was how that understanding could be turned inside out. It was a late Tuesday in October when you found the file. Not through any act of investigation. You weren't that kind of person, weren't prone to searching for things you hadn't been asked to find. You found it the way most people find things that change their lives, by accident, while looking for something else. You were working in the senator's secondary office, the smaller one used for drafting sessions, where the physical files for current legislative work were kept, searching for a specific policy brief you needed for a healthcare speech due that Friday. The filing system was organised by legislative session, and the brief should have been in the third drawer, but it wasn't, and in reaching further back, you pulled out a folder that was heavier than it looked and labelled, in the senator's own handwriting, with a project name you didn't recognise. You should have put it back. You almost did, but the word on the tab, a project name that referenced a defence contractor you'd been writing infrastructure language around for 2 months, made you pause just long enough to open it. And once you opened it, you couldn't close it cleanly. The folder contained internal correspondence between the senator's office and a lobbying firm, a financial summary from a legal entity you didn't recognise, and a memo, 2 pages, single-spaced, clinical in its language, that described a quid pro quo arrangement so precisely documented that it read less like evidence of wrongdoing and more like the minutes of a meeting where everyone present had already decided wrongdoing was acceptable. The defence contractor had funded, through an intermediary structure, a significant portion of the senator's exploratory presidential committee. In exchange, 3 specific provisions in the Defence Authorisation Bill, provisions you had helped write the public justification for, provisions you had spoken about in briefing rooms as genuine policy improvements, had been designed from the beginning to benefit that contractor's competitive position. The public justification was language you had crafted. The private justification was in this folder. You stood in the empty office for a long moment, holding the papers, listening to the building around you, the distant phones, the ventilation hum, the ordinary bureaucratic noise of a place where people were going about their work. Then you put the folder back exactly where you had found it, picked up a different brief that wasn't the one you needed, and walked back to your desk. At first, you told yourself you needed more information before forming a conclusion. It was a reasonable thing to tell yourself, professionally credible, the kind of caution that could be justified from multiple angles. You didn't go back to the folder, that felt too deliberate, but you began paying attention to things you had previously allowed to move past you at the periphery. The contractor's name appeared in more places than you'd noticed before. A meeting you'd been asked to prepare talking points for, which you'd assumed was a routine constituent engagement, had 3 attendees from the lobbying firm whose name appeared in the folder. A legislative amendment that the senator had asked you to craft justification language for on a tight 48-hour timeline was, when you looked more carefully at its specifics, almost surgically designed to benefit one particular competitive bidding scenario. You had written the public language around it. The language was good, genuinely plausible, drawing on real policy arguments. That was your skill, and it had been used. You started keeping notes. Not a formal record, nothing that felt like building a case, but a personal document on your home laptop where you dated and described what you observed. You told yourself this was protective, a record of your own awareness in case anything surfaced later. You didn't examine too closely whether that framing was honest. Then, slowly, you began to feel the information changing how you operated. In meetings, you found yourself listening differently, not to what was being said, but to the gap between what was said and what you now suspected. You sat in a briefing with the senator's policy director and watched him explain the merits of a provision you knew had been written backward from a donor outcome, and you nodded at appropriate intervals, and afterward, you went to the bathroom and stood at the sink with the cold water running over your hands until your breathing steadied. You were still writing the speeches. You told yourself you could do that honestly, that the language itself was true even if the policy context around it was not, that your craft could remain clean inside a compromised system. You told yourself this more often as the weeks passed, which was itself a sign that you believed it less. One evening, the senator asked you to stay late to work on remarks for a national security forum, an address that would reach a genuinely large audience, that would help build the presidential narrative, that would require you to speak with conviction about his commitment to defense procurement reform. Reform. The word sat in the middle of the draft like something foreign, and you looked at it for a long time before you wrote the paragraph around it. The paragraph was excellent. You knew it was excellent. You hated it with the specific precision of someone who understands exactly what they've made. What you hadn't understood until a conversation that happened 6 weeks after finding the folder was that you weren't the only person in the building who knew. Marcus, the senator's deputy chief of staff, had been with the office longer than you. Quiet, methodical, the kind of person who processes information over time rather than reacting immediately. You'd always had an easy professional relationship with him, the low-key mutual respect of two people who work well in adjacent lanes without needing to discuss it. He stopped by your desk one afternoon under the pretext of reviewing the forum's speech draft, and after a few minutes of genuine notes, he said, without looking up from the page, "You found the Caldwell folder." You went very still. "I'm not asking you to confirm it," he said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything. "I'm telling you that you're not alone in knowing, and that this matters for what you're thinking about doing next." You asked him how long he'd known. "Long enough," he said, "and I've made a set of choices about it that I'm not entirely comfortable with, which is why I'm telling you now instead of staying quiet." He finally looked up. "The senator is building toward an announcement, presidential exploratory, officially in the spring. The Caldwell arrangement is load-bearing for that financing structure. If it becomes public before the announcement, the campaign ends before it starts. If it becomes public after, it's something else." Something else. You understood what he meant. Not just a scandal mid-campaign, with a full opposition research apparatus trained on every document, every disclosure, every word you had written as justification for the policy provisions. Your name would be part of the story. Not the center of it, but present, the way a signature on a document is present, as evidence of authorship, as a record of participation. You asked Marcus what he was going to do. He said he hadn't decided. He said he thought you should decide first, because you had the cleaner position, less embedded in the operational structure, more defensibly positioned as someone who discovered rather than participated, and your decision would affect what options remained for everyone else. After he left, you sat at your desk for a long time with the forum speech in front of you, reading the paragraph about procurement reform, and understanding that the word you'd been using to justify your continued presence here, that you were simply a craftsman, that the words themselves were honest, that your skill was separable from its application, had finally exhausted itself. You were not just a craftsman. You were the person who made the dishonesty legible, who translated private corruption into public language so beautifully that people believed it. That was not a neutral function. Over the following 2 weeks, you became acutely aware of how much of what you had built your professional identity around was now working against you. The thing that made you valuable, your ability to find the language that made complicated, compromised positions sound principled and clear, was exactly the thing that had made you complicit. You were too good at your job. And being too good at a job, deployed in service of something dishonest, didn't make you less culpable. It made you more so. You began to understand something that you suspected many people in similar positions never fully reckon with. That proximity to power is its own form of corruption. Not in the dramatic sense of bribes and betrayals, but in the quieter sense of becoming structurally dependent on the continued operation of the thing you serve. Your income, your access, your professional reputation, all of it was bound to the senator's trajectory. His advancement was your advancement. His exposure was your exposure. You thought about the journalists you'd known in your previous life, and how some of them had navigated similar positions, knowing things, sitting on things, deciding over time that the access was more valuable than the disclosure. You had watched some of them and thought you understood their reasoning, and also thought you wouldn't make the same choice. That confidence felt different now. One night, working late alone in the office, you opened a blank document and wrote a first draft of what you knew. Not for any specific purpose, no addressee, no plan, just an act of organising the information into coherent form, the way a writer processes things, through the structure of sentences. You wrote for 2 hours, factually, without editorialising, and what emerged was a document that was clear and damning, and, you recognised with a cold professional appreciation, well written. You saved it to an encrypted folder on your personal drive, and closed the laptop and sat in the dark office, thinking about what it meant that you'd done that. The choice arrived in the form of a phone call at 9 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the senator's planned announcement. The voice on the other end was a journalist, not someone you knew personally, but someone whose work you respected, a national reporter who covered money in politics with the careful, well-sourced methodology that produced the kind of story that didn't go away. She introduced herself calmly and said she was working on a story about the Caldwell Corporation's relationships with congressional offices and that she had reason to believe your office was relevant to that story. She was not asking for confirmation. She was offering the professional courtesy of a chance to respond before publication, which was standard practice and also, you understood, a way of telling you that the story was already sufficiently sourced to run. She asked if you had anything you wanted to say. You said you needed 24 hours. She gave you 12. You hung up and sat in your car in the building garage for a long time, engine off, the silence of late-night concrete around you. You thought through the options the way you'd been thinking through them for weeks, but with the clarity that deadlines impose. You could say nothing, decline comment, let the story run on its existing sources,
remain officially uninvolved. The story would likely still be published. Her tone had suggested it was solid enough, but your name might be peripheral rather than central, and the senator's team would almost certainly frame any staffers who cooperated with press as having acted disloyally. You would probably keep your job through the initial storm if you stayed quiet. You might not keep it afterward, depending on how the story landed. But there was a version of quiet survival available. You could call the senator's communications director, flag the contact, let the office manage the response. This was technically your professional obligation under your contract.
It would also mean handing the information about the journalist's inquiry to people who would use it to suppress or shape the story. And it would tie you more firmly to the cover, not the disclosure. Or you could call the journalist back, tell her what you knew, on background, or on record if you chose to go that far. Become, in the vocabulary of these things, a source, a whistleblower, technically, though that word carried a heroic weight that you weren't sure was appropriate for someone who had spent months writing the speeches that helped construct the cover. You thought about the 2-hour document on your encrypted drive. You thought about the paragraph on procurement reform that you had written and hated and delivered anyway. You thought about the things you knew and the sentences you'd built around them and the people who had sat in audiences and trusted those sentences as true. You called the journalist back 40 minutes before her deadline. You talked for 90 minutes. You were not on record. You couldn't bring yourself to go that far, not yet. But you provided enough to be useful, enough to direct her toward the documentation she needed, enough to make the story what it should be, rather than what it might have been without you. You told her about the folder, the memo, the provisions. You described the structure without performing heroism about it. You said, at one point, "I wrote the justification language for 3 of those provisions. I want you to know that." She said she appreciated the context. When you hung up, you sat again in the silence and waited for the feeling people describe in moments like this. Relief, or conviction, or the clean sensation of having done the right thing. What you felt instead was simply tired and exposed and uncertain, and present in the way a person is present when they have stopped managing the distance between themselves and a truth. The story ran 4 days later. It was thorough, carefully sourced, and built around documentary evidence that the journalist had obtained through channels that didn't require your name. You appeared in it as a person familiar with the senator's office, in a single paragraph, your contribution visible to anyone who knew what to look for, and invisible to anyone who didn't. The senator's communications team went into crisis mode immediately. The full repertoire of denial, contextualization, and counter-narrative. For about 48 hours, it held the ambiguous position of being a story in political media without having fully broken into the broader public conversation. Then, a second outlet published a follow-up with additional documentation, and then a third. And the weight of corroboration did what corroboration does. The presidential exploratory announcement was quietly postponed, then indefinitely deferred. You were called into the senator's office 4 days after publication. He knew. He didn't say he knew. The meeting was framed as a general review of communications protocols in light of the press situation. But you could tell by the way he looked at you, carefully and without the warmth he'd always maintained in your professional relationship, that he had located the source well enough to be certain. He didn't fire you that day. He was too politically careful to create a visible retaliation narrative. Instead, your role was gradually restructured over the following weeks. Fewer access points, smaller assignments, the methodical professional diminishment that organizations use when they want you to leave without the exposure of letting you go. You resigned 6 weeks later, with a formal letter that said nothing and a private understanding that the resignation was mutual. Marcus left 2 months after you. He published a longer account eventually, on record, which added significantly to the public record and cost him considerably more than it cost you. You read it when it came out and felt the complicated mixture of respect and guilt that comes from watching someone take a harder step than the one you took. You spent several months in professional uncertainty. The market for former senior political staffers who had been adjacent to a scandal was, predictably, complicated. You did some consulting work, some writing, took a position eventually with a policy research organization that valued your institutional knowledge more than it was deterred by your history. The work was quieter, less visible, less intoxicating. You found that you didn't miss the intoxication as much as you'd expected. You found that writing things you believed was slower, but felt different in a way that was hard to explain, and also hard to give up once you had it back. The senator's career didn't end immediately or cleanly. There were investigations, depositions, a prolonged legal process that moved through the system with institutional patience. He was not ultimately charged. The structure of the arrangement was sufficiently layered to make criminal culpability difficult to establish. But the political trajectory was permanently redirected, the presidential ambition quietly buried, the narrative of reformer in waiting replaced by the more durable narrative of a politician whose relationship with donor money was more complicated than advertised. You were not satisfied by this outcome. Satisfaction implies that the ending fit the wrongdoing, and this one didn't, not precisely. But you had stopped expecting precision from institutions and had started settling for direction, and the direction here, however slowly, however imperfectly, had moved toward accountability rather than away from it. You thought sometimes about the speech at the National Security Forum, the one with the procurement reform paragraph, about the audience that had listened and believed and applauded, about what it meant to hold language that was technically true and contextually dishonest, and deliver it beautifully. About the specific power of a person who can make words do that, and the specific responsibility that came with it. Speechwriters are invisible by design. They sit behind the voice, behind the face, behind the applause that breaks when a crowd hears exactly what they needed to hear. The power of that position is borrowed from the principal, from the audience, from the ideas themselves. And because it's borrowed, it's easy to tell yourself it doesn't carry its own moral weight. But borrowed power is still power. The person who finds the sentence that makes a corrupt position sound principled is not a neutral actor. The craft doesn't exist in a separate moral register from the content it serves. You can be excellent at your work and still be responsible for what your excellence makes possible. What this story asks, what it quietly insists upon, is that the invisible people in every room consider their own position more honestly than the comfort of invisibility tends to require. The ones who write the words, manage the narratives, translate private decisions into public language. The ones who know things and decide, week by week, that staying is more manageable than speaking. The decision you made in that car at 9 p.m. on deadline is not a heroic story. You waited months. You went on background rather than record. You let someone else take the harder step. But you made it. Imperfectly, late, with full awareness of your own complicity. And that imperfect decision, made by an imperfect person, was enough to change the shape of what happened next. The question worth carrying forward is a simple one. What are you currently helping to make beautiful that doesn't deserve to be?